I thought losing my job in Denver was the lowest point of my life. But man, I had no idea what was waiting for me when I moved back into my grandfather's old cabin, because one morning, I walked out with a cup of coffee and found a massive orange sign nailed across the only bridge to my home. No access. HOA, authorized personnel only. Imagine that. Waking up and finding out you've been locked inside your own property. That's when it hit me. Apparently, I now lived in a gated community, except I never signed up for it. And the gatekeeper? A woman named Victoria Hale. Picture a retired civics teacher who never stopped grading papers. Clipboard in one hand, permanent frown in the other. She had these thick glasses that made her eyes bug out, and the way she carried herself. You'd think she was chairing the Supreme Court, not running a lakeside HOA. The first time she introduced herself, I was standing there staring at the sign, still trying to wrap my head around it. She marched up in this oversized navy blazer, bun pulled so tight I swear it was cutting off circulation to her brain. "Excuse me," she said, like I was some kid chewing gum in class. "I'm Victoria Hale, president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. You can't park here. This bridge is community property and unauthorized vehicles are prohibited." Community property? That bridge was built by my grandfather in the 1960s with his own two hands. I'd crossed it 1,000 times growing up. I rolled down my window, trying to keep things civil. "Look, I think there's been a mistake. My name's Ryan Carter. That cabin across the bridge, it's mine. My grandfather left it to me. I've got the deed, the tax records, everything." I held up the paperwork, thinking that would settle it. But she barely glanced at it. Her lips pressed into this thin little line, and then out came the clipboard. And that's when the nightmare really began. She started writing, like she was issuing me a parking ticket. "Mr. Carter, property ownership does not automatically grant unlimited access rights. This bridge serves the entire community, and we have regulations." Then, without even missing a beat, she looked past me at my porch. "And another thing, your American flag is in violation. Community guidelines specify personal flags cannot exceed a 2-to-1 ratio compared to the HOA banner." I turned and looked. My grandfather's old flag, barely 3 feet wide, hung from the porch post. Meanwhile, at the entrance of the neighborhood, the HOA had a giant 20-foot banner flapping in the wind. The math didn't add up. But I wasn't about to argue on my first day back. She handed me a slip, my first citation, for improper flag display. "Where can I get a copy of these guidelines?" I asked. And then she smiled, not kindly. More like a teacher who just caught a kid without his homework. "All residents receive a handbook upon proper registration with the HOA. Since your grandfather never registered, you'll need to go through the orientation." She pulled out a binder thicker than a college textbook and shoved it into my hands. Great. Homework. That night, I sat at the cabin table flipping through page after page of insane rules. Lawn height specifications, down to the half-inch. Approved paint colors, basically 3 shades of beige. Mailbox requirements, porch light wattage, even the angle your car had to be parked in the driveway. And the kicker? Half the rules contradicted each other. One section said mailbox height must be between 36 and 42 inches. Another section said standard U.S. postal regulation height, which is 36. Guess which one she decided to enforce? Yeah, the one that made me non-compliant. And as I sat there with that stupid binder, I couldn't shake this feeling. Something was off. My grandfather lived here for over 40 years. Never once had he mentioned HOA problems. Never once did I see that bridge labeled as community property. But I brushed it off. Told myself I was just paranoid. Until that night, when the same pair of headlights crept past my window. Twice. And each time, when I looked out, the car was gone. The very next morning, taped to my door. Another citation, this time for my mailbox. According to Victoria, it was 2 inches below regulation height. I measured it myself, 36 inches, perfectly standard. But the HOA handbook said it had to be measured from the base of the post to the bottom of the mailbox opening, not the top. By the time I finished, sweat dripping, dirt on my hands, there she was again, Victoria, standing at the end of the driveway, clipboard ready, like she'd been waiting for me to finish. "Better," she said, jotting a note. Then her eyes flicked to my car. "Though I notice your vehicle is at an improper angle. Community standards require parking parallel to the property line, not diagonal." I stared at my car, parked straight in the driveway. But apparently, because the driveway curved slightly with the natural land, my car was angled. Another citation. In the first 10 days, I racked up 7 more citations. Did need. Garden gnome was an unauthorized decorative element. Did need. Porch light was excessive brightness. Did need. Grandfather's wildflowers? Inappropriate plant species. Every single time, Victoria showed up personally. "I taught civics for 20 years, Mr. Carter," she'd lecture. "Rules create order, order creates harmony." Harmony? I was broke, exhausted, and being treated like a delinquent in my own home. By the end of week 2, I'd paid nearly $3,000 in fines. My savings were circling the drain. But what really ate at me wasn't the money, it was her tone. The way she talked to me like I was a child. So one day, I snapped. I pointed out that her own property, yes, her own, violated half the handbook. Her shrubs were too tall, her porch light didn't match wattage requirements, even her driveway angle was off. For just a moment, her face cracked, a flicker of doubt. Then the mask snapped back into place. "Mr. Carter," she said coldly, "I am the president of this association. I know which rules apply to whom." And she pressed her pen so hard against the clipboard, I thought she'd rip the page. "Speaking of which, your trash can is visible from the street. That's another violation." Another fine. By then, I was developing this nervous little ritual. Peek through the blinds before stepping outside. Scan the road for headlights. Listen for her car. I felt hunted in my own home. And that's when I started digging. Late nights on my laptop, researching HOA law, property rights. What I found was both encouraging and terrifying. Yes, HOAs have insane power. But it's not unlimited. They have to follow process. They can't just invent rules out of thin air. So when I checked one of my citations, Section 15FC about garden decorations, I found out it had been amended just 3 months ago. Originally, it only prohibited offensive displays. Now, it banned all decorations unless specifically approved by the board. And guess what? So I decided to confront her. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up. 15 older residents sat around like it was a church social. Victoria at the front table, gavel in hand, smug as ever. When the floor opened for concerns, I stood. "I want to be a good neighbor," I said. "I'll follow reasonable rules. But citing me for flowers that were planted 30 years ago? That's not reasonable. That's excessive. The room went quiet. Victoria adjusted her glasses and fixed me with those magnified eyes. Your grandfather understood community standards. He complied for decades. The fact that you struggle suggests you may need additional guidance. Additional guidance. Like I was a failing student. Several residents nodded along. And just like that, the message was clear. Comply or face the consequences. As the meeting broke up, a younger woman walked over to me in the parking lot. She introduced herself as Lena Brooks, a paralegal who lived near the lake entrance. That was rough, she whispered. Victoria's been getting worse. But most folks just pay the fines and move on. Easier than fighting her. Then she glanced around, lowered her voice. But with you, it feels personal. Short pause. She was right. This wasn't about HOA rules. This was about Victoria Hale, and she'd just decided I was her new target.
And that's how it all began.
I thought moving back to my grandfather's cabin would give me peace, a fresh start. Instead, it put me in the crosshairs of an HOA president who wanted nothing more than to break me. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the one thing she tried to control, the bridge she blocked, didn't belong to her. It belonged to me. And once I realized that, everything changed. Before I dive in, let me ask you something. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story with someone you know. Because trust me, HOAs get away with this nonsense all the time. And the more people know, the harder it is for them to keep bullying homeowners into silence. All right, let's get back into it. After that first HOA meeting, I knew I wasn't just dealing with some harmless busybody. This was war. Victoria Hale wasn't enforcing rules. She was creating them. She twisted every bylaw like it was clay in her hands, reshaping the community into her personal fiefdom. And I was her new target. The harassment came daily. Citations taped to my door like clockwork. So more Metfather's birdhouse. Unauthorized decorative element. So more porch light. Non-standard color temperature. So Maine wildflower garden. Unapproved species. Every fine came with her lecture. I taught civics for 20 years, Mr. Carter. She'd scold. Rules create order. Order creates harmony. Harmony. Yeah, tell that to my bank account. Bled dry by thousands in fines I couldn't afford. But what made it unbearable wasn't the money. It was the feeling of being watched. Every night, headlights crawled past my window. Same car, same routine. Sometimes it lingered. Engine humming. Someone inside, just watching. By the time I pulled back the curtains, gone. At first, I thought it was paranoia. But no, it was surveillance. Victoria had turned my neighbors into spies. Then came the so-called disciplinary hearing. The letter said I was required to attend. The language made it sound like a courtroom summons. When I arrived, the community center was set up like a tribunal. Victoria at the center, gavel in hand. 3 board members flanking her. And on the table in front of them, stacks of citations. My citations, like a prosecutor's file. I stood alone in the middle of the room while they read the list. Every flag violation, every mailbox measurement, every so-called infraction. Then Richard Doyle, tall, silver hair, smug as a snake, leaned back in his chair and said, "Mr. Carter, your presence here has disrupted community harmony." Community harmony. I wanted to shout, but I kept my voice even. These rule changes were never voted on. You can't just amend bylaws in secret. That's illegal procedure. I even handed out printed copies, showing the edits. Didn't matter. Victoria adjusted her glasses, gave me that cold teacher stare, and said, "The board has full authority to interpret and enforce. If you can't adapt to community standards, perhaps this isn't the right place for you." And then she leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Maybe your family would be happier elsewhere."
My blood went cold, because now it wasn't just about me. My daughter comes to stay with me every other weekend. She plays on that porch. She rides her bike across that bridge. And this woman, this power-drunk HOA president, just implied that she didn't belong. I clenched my fists so tight I thought my nails might break skin. But I didn't give her the outburst she wanted. I just packed my papers, stared her down, and walked out. But inside, I was on fire. That night, things escalated. I caught movement outside, stepped onto the porch, and there she was, Victoria camera in hand, snapping photos of my daughter's bicycle leaned against the porch rail. I stormed out. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She didn't even flinch, just raised her chin and said, "Documenting violations. A bicycle, a child's bicycle, on my own porch." I shouted at her to leave, and finally she did, but not before, scribbling something in that damn notebook of hers. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. She wanted me gone. The next day, I got the notice, suspended from all community amenities. First the pool, then the playground, then the clubhouse. They stripped me of everything. And then the final insult. I walked out to my driveway and found a bright yellow boot clamped on my car tire. Angry laugh, they immobilized my car. Over unpaid fines, I couldn't drive to work, couldn't get groceries. My car sat there on display like a scarlet letter, while neighbors walked by and whispered. But the worst moment came at the community block party. I thought, maybe, just maybe, we could forget the fight for one night, eat some barbecue, let my daughter play with the other kids. But halfway through, Victoria marched over with her bored cronies. They looked at my daughter's wristband. Non-residents aren't allowed access without prior approval. I said, "She's not a guest. She lives here. This is her home every weekend." They called her a TRESPASSER. And then, in front of everyone, Victoria flagged down the off-duty police officers working security. She told them my daughter was trespassing on HOA property. Shaky breath, I'll never forget the way my little girl looked at me, her hand tightening around mine. "Daddy, what's happening?" My heart broke. I wanted to lose it, scream, fight. But I did instead. Instead, I did the only thing I could. I pulled out my phone and hit record. That clip exploded. Overnight, it went viral. HOA bans child from playground. HOA humiliates father. HOA calls police on little girl. It was everywhere. Local news, social media, talk shows, and for the first time, the smug mask slipped. Victoria tried damage control, called it a misunderstanding, claimed it was about liability. But the internet doesn't forgive, and the people in that room, my neighbors, who had once nodded along to every lecture, suddenly weren't so sure anymore. But here's the thing. You'd think that kind of exposure would scare her off, that she'd back down. But no, the public shame only made her more ruthless. The citations doubled. The fines got bigger, and behind the scenes, I started hearing whispers, other families, other neighbors, people who'd been targeted before, forced out, pressured to sell. Silenced Victoria had a pattern, and I was just the next in line. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my grandfather left me more than just a cabin. He left me something else, something buried in a box of dusty old papers, something that would flip this entire war upside down. And once I found it, everything changed. The morning after the block party fiasco, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery, engines grinding gears, men shouting instructions. I rushed to the porch and froze at the bridge, the only bridge to my cabin. Workers in hard hats were nailing up wooden barriers. Bright orange construction signs warned, "Bridge closed for safety inspection. Authorized personnel only." And standing right there, supervising like a queen on her throne, was Victoria Hale, clipboard in hand, smug expression on her face. When she saw me, she raised her voice so the workers could hear. "Mr. Carter, this bridge has been deemed structurally unsound by the Pine Lake Safety Committee. For liability reasons, access is restricted until repairs are complete." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Structurally unsound. That bridge had been solid since the day my grandfather built it. Treated lumber, steel reinforcement, the kind of craftsmanship you just don't see anymore. And her safety committee consisted of herself and Richard Doyle. No engineers, no professionals, not even a basic inspection report, but the barriers went up anyway. By noon, my cabin was cut off. I was trapped. The impact was immediate. Groceries, forget it. I had to haul them 3 miles on foot through rough forest trails. Deliveries, cancelled. A job interview over video call dropped 3 times because my internet, already unstable, became unusable after service vehicles rerouted cables. A consulting contract I'd been counting on fell through when I couldn't make it to an meeting in Denver. Within 2 weeks, I had lost weight from sheer exhaustion. Not healthy weight, the kind you lose from stress, skipped meals, and endless uphill climbs with supplies strapped to your back. And all the while, Victoria paraded around, the community telling residents she had saved them from liability by closing a dangerous bridge. It was a lie, a calculated move to isolate me until I either broke down or gave up. But isolation wasn't enough for her. 10 days after the closure, the board held an emergency meeting about my situation. I dragged myself there on foot, sweaty, sore, carrying a folder full of documents. The community center was packed. Word had spread, and people were curious to see the drama unfold. Victoria banged her gavel and launched into a speech. She spoke about duty, responsibility, safety, about how the HOA was protecting everyone by closing a bridge that posed potential collapse risks. The crowd nodded along. She looked like the hero. When the floor opened, I stood up, my voice cracked with anger and exhaustion, but I laid out the truth. I explained that no professional inspection had ever been done, that my grandfather had maintained that bridge for 60 years without incident, that the timing of the closure, just days after I challenged her authority, was no coincidence. And then, in the heat of it all, I lost my composure. I shouted, "I'm a human being, not a compliance barcode. Do you want a community, or do you want a prison camp?" The words echoed. The room went dead silent. For a brief second, I thought I saw something flicker in Victoria's expression, not triumph, not smugness, something closer to regret, vulnerability, but it was gone in an instant. She regained her poise, smoothed her blazer, and spoke calmly into the microphone. "Mr. Carter clearly needs time to understand community values and appropriate conduct. This outburst only proves why standards must be enforced. A few residents clapped, others shifted uncomfortably, but the damage was done. I had played right into her hands. I looked like the unhinged troublemaker. That night, defeated, I sat in my grandfather's old chair, staring out at the dark water. For the first time, I considered selling the cabin, walking away, letting her win. But then I thought of my grandfather, a man who worked his whole life to build not just that cabin, but the bridge that connected it to the world. And I realized he had left me more than a house. He had left me a legacy, a principle. Never let bullies win. So instead of packing up, I climbed into the attic. The attic was a time capsule. Boxes of old tools, yellowed magazines, hunting gear from another era. I dug through it all, searching for anything that might help me understand the history of the property. And then, buried beneath a stack of National Geographic from the 1970s, I found a cookie tin. Faded flowers painted on the lid, inside, bundles of documents. Property surveys, receipts, insurance papers, and letters. Dozens of them, written in my grandfather's steady handwriting to my grandmother, but tucked at the bottom. Under everything else, I found the gold. Official correspondence with the county, permits, tax receipts, in one letter dated April 15th, 1960. My grandfather requested permission to build a private bridge across the lake outlet stream. The county approved it. On May 3rd, 1960, they issued him the permit. He was responsible for maintenance and for paying an annual bridge tax. The receipts told the rest of the story. Year after year, payments recorded under Morrison Bridge, tax ID 4471. And the best part, the payments had continued all the way up to the present. The bridge wasn't community property. It wasn't even shared property. It was private, my grandfather's, and now mine. The next morning, I hiked into town and walked straight into the county clerk's office. Curtis Myers, the clerk, had been there for over 30 years. He remembered my grandfather well. When I laid the documents on his desk, he smiled. Your granddad was proud of that bridge, paid the tax faithfully, never missed a year. He tapped a few keys on his computer, then turned the screen toward me, still here in the records. Morrison Bridge, tax ID 4471. As far as this county's concerned, that bridge is yours, has been since 1961. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. For weeks I had been powerless, trapped, harassed. But in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't trapped. I was the owner. The HOA had been trespassing on my property for decades, and now I finally had the ammunition I needed. Armed with copies of the documents, I contacted the one person in the community I thought I could trust, Lena Brooks, the paralegal who had pulled me aside after the HOA meeting. We met at a small coffee shop in town, far away from the eyes and ears of Victoria's loyalists. When she saw the papers, her jaw dropped. "This is huge," she whispered. "If you own the bridge, the HOA has zero authority. Blocking it was not just overreach, it was illegal. They've been committing trespass for decades." She snapped photos, took notes, and outlined potential legal angles: fraud, abuse of power, violation of property rights. And for the first time in months, I felt hope. But with hope came risk, because if I revealed this too soon, Victoria would find a way to spin it, to twist it, to bury it under bureaucracy. I had to be careful, precise, strategic. So Lena and I planned we would gather more evidence, involve the county clerk as a witness, force the board into a public confrontation they couldn't weasel out of. But in the meantime, I kept my discovery close to my chest, and Victoria, she kept tightening the screws. More fines, more harassment, more pressure to break me. What she didn't know was that every new citation, every boot on my car, every humiliation was only adding fuel to the fire. Because when the truth came out, it wouldn't just clear my name, it would shatter her entire empire. That's where the battle truly began. The HOA had its rules, its fines, its intimidation, but I had something far more powerful, proof, and soon the entire community was going to see it. The night I confirmed that the bridge was legally mine, I barely slept. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of documents, the county permits, the tax receipts, 60 years of unbroken ownership. For weeks, I had been trapped, humiliated, and isolated. But now, I held the one thing Victoria Hale couldn't lecture, bully, or intimidate away. Facts. The next morning, I made 3 copies of everything. One for myself, one for Lena, and one for safekeeping in a lockbox at the county office. I wasn't about to give Victoria a chance to lose the evidence. Lena wasted no time. She called a lawyer she worked with, a man named Charles Denton, retired litigator, sharp, blunt, and not easily intimidated. When he saw the paperwork, his eyebrows lifted. "This is airtight," he said. "The HOA has been trespassing for decades. Blocking that bridge wasn't just an abuse of power. It was a legal confinement. If you wanted, you could press criminal charges." The words hit me like a bell. Criminal charges against Victoria, against the entire board. But Denton wasn't done. If you want real impact, you don't just threaten charges. You hit them where it hurts. Money, reputation, authority, a lawsuit for damages, public exposure. That's how you break an HOA like this. For the first time, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like a predator. We planned carefully. First, we needed witnesses. Other residents who had been harassed, fined, or bullied. Lena started knocking on doors quietly, talking to neighbors one by one. Most were hesitant. Years of intimidation had conditioned them to stay silent. But slowly, cracks appeared. A retired couple admitted Victoria had fined them for having a garden swing that clashed with community standards. A young mother confessed she had been told to remove her children's basketball hoop because it lowered property values. Another family whispered that Victoria had threatened foreclosure over $400 in late dues. One by one, the stories added up. A pattern of abuse. Fear disguised as order. Still, most refused to go public. They were afraid of retaliation. But even their private testimonies gave us ammunition. The tipping point came from an unlikely place. Richard Doyle, the smug board member who had lectured me at the hearing, approached me outside the general store one morning. He looked nervous, glancing around before speaking. "Ryan, I need to talk to you." Privately, we sat in his car. He confessed that the board had been misusing HOA funds. Thousands of dollars redirected to consulting fees that didn't exist. Trips labeled as community outreach. Landscaping projects that were never completed. All signed off by Victoria. Richard admitted he'd been complicit. He signed the checks. But now, with the viral video tarnishing the HOA's image, he was scared. Scared of lawsuits. Scared of losing everything. I didn't trust him. Not entirely, but he gave me copies of internal emails. Proof of the fraud. Enough to show this was bigger than personal harassment. This was corruption. The next HOA board meeting was standing room only. Residents packed into the community center, whispering, buzzing with tension. Everyone had heard about the bridge dispute, about the viral video, about the rumors of corruption. Victoria sat at the head table, gavel in hand, her expression tight but controlled. She called the meeting to order, trying to project authority. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rant. I laid out the documents one by one. The county permits, the tax receipts, the bridge ownership records. Explained that the bridge had never belonged to the community, that the HOA had no authority to close it, that I had been illegally isolated for 2 weeks. The room erupted. Murmurs, gasps, angry whispers. But I wasn't finished. I handed copies of Richard's emails to the lawyer sitting beside me. He read them aloud. Misused funds, falsified invoices, unauthorized expenses. The noise in the room grew louder. For the first time, Victoria's composure cracked. Her lips tightened. Her fingers gripped the gavel so hard her knuckles turned white. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "These documents are being misrepresented. The board has acted in the best interests of this community, but the residents weren't buying it. They shouted questions, demanded answers. Some called for her resignation right then and there. That night, I expected retaliation, but instead, silence. Victoria didn't show up at my cabin. No citations taped to my door. No headlights crawling past my window. It was the calm before the storm. The next morning, I received an official notice. The HOA had hired a law firm. They were challenging my bridge ownership claim, arguing that decades of community use had created implied easement rights. It was a desperate move, and Lena, Charles, and I were ready for it. We filed a lawsuit, not just to affirm my ownership of the bridge, but for damages, financial damages for the harassment, for the fines, for the isolation, punitive damages for fraud and abuse of power. And because the viral video had attracted so much attention, the story spread fast. Local news covered the lawsuit, then regional outlets. Before long, national blogs picked it up. Father takes on HOA, wins back bridge. HOA accused of fraud and bullying. Small community faces big reckoning. The pressure mounted. 2 weeks later, we walked into county court for an emergency hearing. Victoria was there with her attorney, pale but defiant. I sat with Lena and Charles, a stack of documents in front of us. The room was filled with residents, reporters, even a few curious strangers who had followed the story online. The judge listened patiently as both sides presented. Victoria's lawyer argued easement rights. He claimed that decades of shared use made the bridge community property by default. Charles rose to counter. Precise, ruthless. He pointed to the permits, the tax receipts, the continuous ownership. He reminded the court that easements require legal agreements, not casual use. Then he dropped the hammer. The HOA had not only blocked access illegally, but had done so while misappropriating funds and falsifying records. The judge's decision was swift. The bridge was private property. The HOA had no authority. An immediate injunction barred them from interfering with my access ever again. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Residents whispered, some relieved, others stunned. And Victoria. She sat frozen, her empire crumbling around her. But the fight wasn't over. The judge ordered a full audit of the HOA's finances. Within days, Investigators uncovered a trail of fraud, thousands missing, misreported expenses, personal luxuries, disguised as community projects. It wasn't just bad management, it was embezzlement. The Attorney General's office opened a case. Board members resigned one by one, scrambling to distance themselves from Victoria. And Victoria herself, she was served with a subpoena, facing not just civil penalties, but potential criminal charges. The woman who once stood at my driveway lecturing me about community harmony was now the subject of an investigation that could put her behind bars. For the first time in months, I felt free. Neighbors who had avoided me now stopped to talk. Some apologized for staying silent. Others thanked me for standing up. Slowly, the fear that had gripped the community began to lift. The HOA was collapsing, its authority shredded, its funds frozen, its leaders disgraced. But I knew the story wasn't finished. Because when you strip power from people who built their entire identity on it, they don't go quietly. They fight, they scheme, they lash out, and I could feel it in my bones. Victoria wasn't done, not yet. The weeks following the court's injunction felt like stepping out of a storm into clear daylight. For the first time in months, I wasn't waking up to find citations taped to my door. No headlights creeping past my cabin at night. No smug lectures from Victoria Hale standing at the end of my driveway with her clipboard. Instead, there was silence. But silence didn't mean the war was over. It meant the battlefield had shifted. The county's audit of the HOA finances turned up more than anyone expected. The missing money wasn't just a few thousand here and there. It was tens of thousands. Trips disguised as leadership retreats. Luxury items billed as community improvements. Payments to companies that didn't exist. The story hit the local news again, then the regional outlets. Before long, it wasn't just a small-town scandal. It was a headline people across the country were reading. HOA president accused of embezzlement. Community in uproar over fraud and abuse. Board resigns after audit uncovers misuse of funds. The walls of Victoria's empire were closing in. One by one, board members quit. Richard Doyle, the man who once smirked at me from behind his chair, resigned for health reasons. The treasurer, who had signed off on fake invoices, vanished from the neighborhood entirely. Even the secretary, usually silent at meetings, stepped down and left a letter taped to the community bulletin board that simply said, "I can't defend this anymore." The residents were left stunned. For years, they had lived under Victoria's rigid grip, convinced her rules were what kept the community harmonious. Now they realized that harmony had been bought with fear, fines, and fraud. The anger spread quickly. Neighbors who had once nodded along to every lecture suddenly began demanding accountability. They wanted answers. They wanted justice. And most of all, they wanted Victoria gone. The final board meeting before her resignation was like nothing I had ever seen. The community center was packed beyond capacity, standing room only, neighbors who had never spoken. Above a whisper in her presence now shouted for her to step down. Victoria entered the room with her usual poise. Blazer pressed, glasses shining, clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. But there was no hiding the tremor in her fingers as she raised the gavel. She called the meeting to order, but the room didn't quiet. The noise swelled demands, accusations, angry voices all pressing in on her. She slammed the gavel against the table. "This is out of order. I am still the president of this association," and the crowd roared back, drowning her out. Then, from the back, Curtis Myers, the county clerk who had confirmed my bridge ownerships, stood and raised his voice. "Mrs. Hale, this association is under investigation. Your authority is suspended pending the outcome of the audit. If you care about this community at all, you'll step aside." The room erupted in applause. Victoria's face tightened. For the first time, she looked small, cornered. The teacher, who had spent decades lecturing, now looked like a student caught cheating on the final exam. She tried to speak again, but her voice cracked. She set the gavel down, straightened her blazer, and walked out. Just like that, the reign of Victoria Hale was over. The HOA collapsed in the weeks that followed. Without leadership, the structure crumbled. Residents called for a reorganization, but not before taking steps to ensure no one person could ever hold that much unchecked power again. A new board was voted in, younger, more transparent, more willing to listen. Rules were simplified. The endless fines and absurd citations disappeared. The handbook, once thick enough to rival a college textbook, was reduced to a few straightforward pages. For the first time, Pine Lake began to feel like a real community. And I got my life back. The bridge, once plastered with barricades and no access signs, was mine again. I installed a simple wooden sign at the entrance. "Private bridge, please respect." No barriers, no boots, no threats, just a reminder that this was my property, shared by goodwill, not obligation. Neighbors crossed with a nod. Some smiled, some offered a quick word of thanks. It felt different now, like genuine respect instead of grudging compliance. Repaired the cabin porch, replanted my grandfather's wildflowers, even restored the little birdhouse Victoria once called a violation. Each act felt like reclaiming a piece of my grandfather's legacy. The settlement from the lawsuit gave me breathing room, enough to rebuild my consulting work, enough to finally feel stable after months of chaos. But the real victory wasn't money. It was freedom. It was knowing that my daughter could ride her bike across that bridge without being treated like a trespasser, that no one could ever again lock me inside my own home. And it was more than personal, because the fight inspired others. I started receiving messages from strangers across the country, people trapped in their own HOA nightmares, fines for garden gnomes, threats of foreclosure, harassment over paint colors, flags, fences, pets. They saw my story and realized they weren't alone. Some asked for advice. Others just wanted to thank me for standing up. A few even sent me their own documentation, hoping I could help them challenge their boards. I realized something powerful. This wasn't just my fight. It was part of something bigger, a movement against bullies hiding behind bylaws. Months later, I stood on the porch of the cabin at sunset, looking out at the water. The bridge stretched across the lake, glowing in the golden light. It wasn't just wood and steel. It was a symbol, a reminder that my grandfather had built something meant to last, a connection, a lifeline. And when the HOA tried to steal it, tried to steal my freedom, they didn't just underestimate me, they underestimated him, because the man who built that bridge left me more than a property. He left me a lesson. Stand your ground, keep your records, and never let fear dictate your future. So here's what I'll say to you. If you're watching this, and you've ever felt powerless against an HOA or any authority figure who thought rules made them untouchable, remember this. They only have as much power as you give them. And the moment you decide to fight back with facts, with allies, with courage, they crumble. If this story resonated with you, do me a favor, like this. video, subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, because HOAs don't want stories like mine to spread. They thrive in silence, in intimidation, in fear. The more we speak out, the less power they have. And trust me, there's nothing sweeter than watching a bully's clipboard fall from their hands when they realize their authority is gone.